Good afternoon, everybody. Happy National Poetry Month. I don't know if all of you are aware. My name is Leah Middlebrook, and I am the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. And on behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you to our second Cressman Lecture of 2026. The Cressman Lecture was inaugurated in 1997 with a generous bequest from former University of Oregon anthropology professor and archaeologist Luther S. Cressman. The lectureship's goal is the presentation and illumination of fundamental humanities issues that confront societies centrally occupied with science, technology, and business. Our honored guest this afternoon is very well suited to speaking to this context. But before introducing her, I invite us to express our gratitude and appreciation to the OHC staff who have worked so hard to make today's event possible. Gina Turner, our associate director, program coordinator Melissa Gustafson, communications coordinator Peg Fries-Gerhardt, and our student assistant Eleanor Hudson. So Gina, Melissa, Peg, and Eleanor, thank you and bravo. I will also take a moment to offer the following land acknowledgement, which the OHC developed with help from our colleagues in Native American and Indigenous Studies, and in consultation with the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the University of Oregon, to the lands now known as Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people on the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon, and we express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all displaced and Indigenous peoples who call this place, which we call Oregon, home. We give this land acknowledgement both publicly to honor the longstanding and ongoing relationships Kalapuya and other Indigenous people maintain with their homelands, and to remind ourselves and our institutions of our responsibilities and obligations as the bearers of this history. The OHC strives to follow up through our programming, co-sponsorships, and fellowships, and you can learn more information about our activities by perusing our website and looking through episodes of UO Today on YouTube and on SoundCloud. Throughout this year, the OHC has hosted speakers and panels to help us consider the dynamics of attention, to think about and talk about how, why, and what we focus on shapes our reality and creates our purpose. Our decision to devote this year to the theme of attention was, in fact, inspired by Ada Limon, whose writing immerses us in minute, perfectly crafted experiences of attention to, for example, the day a sliver of green of a new leaf reveals itself and begins to unfurl against the gray of a branch, as in her poem, Instructions on Not Giving Up, which appears on page 125 of Startlement, the new and selected poems published by Milkweed Editions in 2025. Or to a flock of birds wheeling in air unbound with bird, to quote from another poem, Ways to Ease Your Animal Mind, which appears on page 69. Ada Limon has talked about poetry making as observation and organization. Her work combines attentiveness to the sensual prompts of the world around us with deft skills in shaping language, in measuring syllable, word, line, stanza, to create poems she has referred to as containers for experience. And returning to that poem I just quoted, Ways to Ease Your Animal Mind, listen to what she does with alliteration and assonance at the opening of that poem. A cloud of cormorants comes flooding out of rushed wind. Other poems capture for us the experience of stars, groundhogs, trees, of subway rides, lakeside cocktails, girlhood, or devastating news. Ada Limon has published 9 books of poetry, if I've counted correctly, 2 children's books, 2 chapbooks, and numerous essays. She was appointed the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States by the Library of Congress and served in that role from 2022 to 2025. Among many distinctions, she has been awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship, and her poem, In Praise of Mystery, was engraved on NASA's Europa Clipper spacecraft. And that honor does have a little extra resonance for us here at the University of Oregon, because one of the co-investigators on the Europa mission is in fact faculty at the Honors College and in the Earth Sciences department here. So a great moment for interdisciplinary research, I must say. As you can see, J. Michael's Bookstore is doing a book sale, and Ada has graciously agreed to a book signing after this event. But a note that we will be wrapping everything up by 6:15 p.m. Also, this event is being live streamed. Hello, live stream. It is being live streamed and recorded to be posted on the OHC's YouTube channel and can be accessed via YouTube or the OHC website, which is ohc.uoregon.edu, in the coming week, joining hundreds of other archived lectures and interviews. And now, we are honored indeed to have Ada Limon with us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello and welcome. How are you? Yeah? Oh, it's so good to be here. You know, when I give original talks, I change them up until the very last minute. And so this is very fresh. Printed at the hotel 1 moment ago. But it's such a pleasure to be here, and this is only the second event I'm doing since this book came out, the little book, which is Against Breaking on the Power of Poetry, which is the expanded version of the talk I gave for the Library of Congress. And I'm so pleased that it's here, so that's exciting for me. So without much fanfare, I'm going to dive in to this talk. Hello. The Unleaving, how poetry helps you not to miss your life. It's a joy to be back here on this campus, especially during the spring. I haven't been to the University of Oregon since my high school love and my childhood best friend went here in the 90s. For those of you young ones, yes, that was the 1900s. I was going to the University of Washington in Seattle, and when we had spring break or at the end of the year, I'd drive down in my car that somehow still ran a red Ford Tempo, a truly terrible car I bought for $900 the summer of my 18th year. And I'd pick up my boyfriend and we'd drive home with the windows open, listening to our mixtapes all the way down to our hometown in Northern California. I remember seeing a play here on campus while I was studying theater at the drama school at the University of Washington, and how good the play was. I also remember once calling the college admissions counselor here and very earnestly asking about transferring in order to be closer to my boyfriend, a request I don't think I even told him about. She said, and I quote, "Honey, don't change your whole life for a man." And she was right. Because about a year after that phone call, he and I broke up, and I was forced to take an elective that was outside the theater department, and because I was heartbroken and trying to remember the things that I loved, I chose poetry. So maybe in some small tangential way, the University of Oregon and that one phone call to an honest and wise college counselor who was somehow already knew more about love than I did is responsible for why I'm a poet. But I digress, and I kid a little. And truthfully, why I'm a poet is probably a complex amalgam of many reasons. One of those reasons is what I want to talk about today. One of those reasons is the word attention. I have, for my whole life, paid attention. What I haven't done is always pay attention to the right things. Or rather, my attention wasn't always on what was best for my mind, my heart, my body. But I have learned that what we pay attention to, where we put our attention, is not just about noticing the world around you, but embodying your own life. What I want to do today is today in this talk is make a case not just for poetry, but for life itself. This talk is in no way meant to be a punishing lecture or an admonishment on the daily ways in which we embody or do not embody our lives, but rather a way of telling you how poems and the natural world, along with many other tools, and we need all the tools we can get, are simply ways of paying attention. And what we give our attention to defines our lives, whether we know it or not. As Annie Dillard once wrote, the way we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. That might seem simple, but how easy it is to forget that your life happens in all the small moments, not the big overarching celebrations or the soul-crushing heartbreak or defeats, but in each walk to class, in small exchanges with someone who serves you coffee, an encounter with a blooming tree. It's easy, no matter what age you are, to think that you will eventually get around to starting your real life. I am intimately familiar with this idea, that sometime beyond the bleary grasp of the day, with its many annoying tasks set out before you, your life will actually begin. I remember thinking it as a child, that somehow the days felt like an endless waiting to grow older, to be free, to fall in love, to make all our own choices for something, anything to happen. Even now, as I write this, I'm tugged at the sleeve by some imaginary spirit that wants me to be doing something else, heading outdoors, looking at birds, checking my emails, napping, seeing my parents, writing a poem. And yet here I am writing this now and thinking of the ways in which our lives are ruled by attention, what takes it, what keeps it, what kidnaps it, what distractions keep us from being fully aware of our own lives. And yes, I know it would be an obvious choice for me to make this talk about smartphones and social media platforms, and how easily I can be distracted by scrolling over and over until my brain feels not like my own, but like a collective soft blur that is somehow mushed together with everyone else's collective soft blur. I am as guilty as anyone of scrolling for hours, and I have a quick trick to bring me back to myself. I say, "What a waste of my beautiful brain." I say it aloud to myself and slide the phone into the charger and try again to live in the world. The two things that help me the most with this process of re-entry to the land of the living are poetry and the natural world. Right now, as I'm writing this, the sky has gone from gray to an almost bright white, as it looks like the clouds and sun are somehow battling it out on the sky stage for the thing we've come here to discuss: attention. The way the light is illuminating specific plants in the back garden feels like a movie set. The bird bath is lit up, though there are no birds in it. The rosemary bush is now lit up with what looks like a spotlight, so you can see that it is alive with bees. I can't hear it from here, but I can imagine the sound. And just like that, the clouds have dimmed their light again. I write this not to be poetic or profound, but as a way of behaving like the sun itself in a process of illumination. I made myself look out the window and simply describe what I saw. But what it did, even briefly, was remind myself that I am a living thing, capable of noticing what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls the good green world. When I first began to be aware of the power of noticing, I was quite young. I realized that whatever tree I paid attention to seemed to almost flourish in my gaze. Of course, that wasn't happening. Or was it? But it seemed that when I looked at a tree or a flower, it would show itself to me more fully, as if being seen illuminated it from within. When I began to notice that my gaze changed things, I began to want to name and identify the plants and animals around me as a way of leaning in closer, noticing more, regardless of the names themselves. It was about learning what was all around me at all times, their form and function, the isness of them. The way I started paying attention to plants and animals is the same way I started writing poems. Is that true? I believe it is. If I began with naming what was outside of me, the rattlesnake grass growing among the poppies, and the tall green grass that seemed unnameable because it was everywhere, the crawdads in the rocky shadows of the creek bed, the high metallic vibrating call of the spotted towhee. If I began there, I could then begin to name what was present in my own interior wilderness of the mind and the body. Out there, there's a tree, under a streetlight, slowly bouncing in the breeze. In here, pointing to my chest and head now, there is a light bulb swinging in my grandparents' garage, and the memory of the smell of rain on sawdust, and the memory of a train whistle, the feeling of being both comforted and misunderstood. There seemed to be sharp cacti everywhere, king snakes, and the oppressive heat of the canyon. And at the end of a long hallway, my grandfather had a large clock called that I was told was called a grandfather clock. And so I thought all large clocks were named after my grandfather. I'm following my thoughts now and trying my best to show you the inside of my brain. Why? Because a poem, for me, begins with naming and identifying what I see and feel, and then allowing the synapses of the brain to ping around with free range. Praise the wandering mind. Praise the imagination station. I do not know where a poem is going, and what it's going to become when I make it. I have to follow it until something is revealed, until it teaches me something. The same can be said of looking at nature or being in nature. It's easy to think that one might have the same experience if they did the same hike or walk every day. But for those of us that do that, we know that's not true. That is, if you're paying attention. Each day I go around the same small lake, and each day it's entirely different. I see the same creek every day, and every day it's different. Just now, I set down my computer and did what I call checking the mail. Checking the mail is code in my household for going to the creek. The creek is where I look for birds and stare at the water and meditate and try not to just be of the world, but in the world. I've said before that I'm pretty sure all my poems have come from that creek. That somehow that's where I pull the poems out of the dark water when it's dark, out of the clear water when it's clear. It was lightly raining just now, and so the birds weren't out much, but I saw a chestnut-backed chickadee, a black phoebe, a towhee, and then a small fish surfaced and ate a mosquito that was flying too low to avoid the inevitable snatching. When I came back to the house, on the lemon tree out back, there was an orange-crowned warbler. But the warbler was so hidden that for a long time I thought I was staring at some strange, fuzzy lemon. Just a half an hour break from the words, and I was back in the world where the words come from. I was breathing and stretching and moving my limbs like I was also my own kind of strange bird, half hidden in the fruit tree, half fanning out my feathers. I'm scared now that you'll think I'm obsessed with birds. And if you're not a birder or a bird fan, I promise you don't have to become a birder. But I do think we need to find whatever it is that pulls you out of the chaos of the mind, out of the screens that devour our imagination and hijack our own creative impulses, out of the all too prevalent leaning toward despair. We need to each find that thing, the thing that reminds you of your own life, that you are living, and hold on to it. It's not hard to see how the world is changing in sometimes massively violent and cruel ways, whether we want to or not. That too must not go unnoticed. It is our job to bear witness, and when necessary, leap into action. When the barrage of violence and chaos are overwhelming us, we must also remember that interconnectedness and community are not slogans or wishy-washy ideology of the past, but our natural state of being, to recognize our place in the family of all living things. When the slogan, "Think globally, act locally," was adopted by environmental causes, the idea was to think about larger environmental impacts around the globe while also making smart decisions at home. It's a phrase I use for myself when things are getting out of control, a small mantra. Do what I can right now in some small way to move forward with intention. And if we want to act ultra, hyper locally, then of course, we write poems. What's more extremely hyperlocal than your own mind, your own body, the way in which you perceive and notice the world? When I personally sit down to write a poem, I am paying attention to the world around me, yes, and then I am paying attention to the world inside of me. The two toggle back and forth until something solidifies, takes shape, and reveals itself. Paying attention is what brought me to poetry in the first place. Why? Because paying attention isn't for the faint of heart. Paying attention can get you in trouble. As a child, I remember feeling overwhelmed by noticing. When I was staring out the window, looking at the oak leaves drift and flutter, and oak catkins fill the air and fly off as if it knew where it was going, and the teacher said, "Pay attention," but I was paying attention. I was paying attention to the tree and the weird mystery it was weaving. But that's just a small and easy example. There are times when I was noticing so much that it would start to feel overwhelming, overpowering, and I wasn't sure where to lay it all down, how to make sense of it. When you are someone who is tender to the world, sensitive to it, it's not always the most ideal thing to pay attention to it all. That's where poetry saved me. Poetry isn't only about paying attention, it's about transforming, shaping, and making space for what it is you're experiencing. It's about making sense of it, holding it. Here, let me bring in a poem of mine that travels through paying attention to both the inner and the outer world. I chose this poem because it's an early one, written in my 20s, and it follows the mapping of the mind. It's also a poem I wrote while living in New York, but it goes back to that creek bed I grew up with, the place where all my poems come from. The Echo Sounder. 1. She enters the world a ready, set, go girl. She comes with a list of things she cannot see. She comes with language restricted by its own inability to name things as she sees them. She believes that there are two worlds, and she lives in the other one that is separate from the other. The seed that comes up outside the garden, the one door with no handle, the shingle in the roof with the weather vane, the arrow flying from the quiver, the child who can balance on her palms and is hated for it. She wears no shirt, still no one speaks to her. She speaks to everyone. She has a bicycle and a family, but it does not matter. She is difficult to catch. She knows all the names of all the fish. She is aware of them dying all the time. Upstream, the sockeye and the coho. Upstream, the chinook and the king. Upstream, to the sand and rock nest of their deaths. She thinks the bodies decay too quickly. 2. When she is 11 years old, she thinks her body will be like that of a fish. She does not want it to decay before she uses it. She is confused in the dark. She is never scared. She is convinced that she can talk to God, and so she asks him a question. She does not get an answer, so she makes one up. She believes the answer is everything stops. The food is in the mouth, but the mouth is not there. The water flows, but there is no creek. She understands now that bodies can swing from trees, and whole families can be locked up, that people die the way fish do, starving sometimes, gutted and tortured by children who think they are being scientific and responsible. She thinks God must know this, and therefore he is ugly. She decides God is no good, but he must exist so she can hold him accountable. She decides this and then forgets. 3. At one point, she decides she's in love, the way she woke up one day and thought she had dreamt up the word Philadelphia. And there was no other word in the world as beautiful as Philadelphia. And how she planned to make it mean something, like the way everything can touch you at once, the mason on the billboard, the old theater's neon sign, the water towers next to the cross, the curve in the road where the school bus stopped, the wet smell of boots and dirt, the feeling when all those things get to you, and you want to cry or pray, but because you're no good at either, you tell everyone to leave you alone, so you can go on feeling the world climbing around in your body like you were just as much a part of it as it was of you. Maybe she thought she could call that feeling Philadelphia. She fell in love the same way. 4. One week, she thinks about offering, how it is difficult to offer something of yourself. She thinks it should be easy, how she has an echo chamber in her chest. What she sends out should reflect and return. She goes to the creek on one trip home and sits there for longer than she planned. She decides to estimate how long she will live, and then she says, "This is when she will die." She says it again, "This is when I will die," as if the repetition will endow the words with nonsense, the way a word becomes no longer a word, but a strange sound that animals make. She takes comfort in her animalness. She wants to go on being an animal, not something that represents something else, but the original object, the thing before it is named, the fish before she knew it was a fish, when it was just another lost thing, individual and shadowy, working its way towards its own end. While that poem is steeped in memory, it's also about letting the mind go where it goes and following it. I never looked for a particular meaning or message, but then my own internal philosophical nature came through. Mapping the mind was the first way I knew how to write poems. You map what's around you, then you map what's inside you. I have spent over half my life writing poems, and now I am acutely aware of my own inner workings. That's not to say I'm not bogged down by my own reoccurring demons, but it does mean that I am familiar with my demons too. When I stare out into the good green world and what comes back to me is despair, I trust that too. I am aware, like most people, that paying attention to nature isn't the same as saving the planet. And as J. Drew Lanham said, watching birds isn't the same as saving birds. The planet is in crisis, and we must act swiftly and with stewardship to save what we can. But we also cannot let the problem defeat us with its enormity. We must find ways to move forward through our own fear. To give you an example of how poetry allowed me to filter fear and anxiety and shift it, I'll bring in my next poem. This is a poem that grapples with how to hold the pain of the world while choosing to stay in the world at the same time. Written in my early 30s, I remember the moment when the world felt so heavy that I couldn't even imagine beginning the poem with I, because I didn't want to carry it. Instead, I changed the tense to a you, so that the second person could protect me, could help shoulder the weight of it all. The same thing. There's an awful story in the news. For days you cannot sleep. It's too hot. It's too cold. It's just another story in the news, not another human, not a whole country, not another animal, just a piece of paper. Then you feel a little better. You go to the train and wear your headphones. You listen to a sad song that sounds familiar. You pass a store window and there's someone you don't know walking where you're walking. Heels, a summer dress, hair tied up too fancy for the week. The television says tomorrow night they will shed some light on hell. How far do we need to search for some bad thing? Hell is not beneath us, not a bargaining chip with your children. You come home on the train and you have bought gifts and tried to be decent. This is how your life will go. You know that. Day after day, awful acceptance, the soft life of your footprints. You start to think of the alternative. You shake your real shirt off in the hallway. Would it be the same if you were born in Mexico? Life, Cuba, Ireland, 1974. You miss everyone, even the people you read about today you didn't know, their faces on the brain as if on paper. You sit on the balcony, which is really a fire escape, but you call it the balcony to make it sound better. You wear the slip your grandmother gave you 15 years ago. The weather is nice, California nice. You sing a little, call your family. You think things aren't so bad. You say you love the world, so love the world. Maybe you don't even say it for yourself. Maybe you move your mouth like everyone moves their mouth. Maybe your mouth is the same mouth as everyone's, all trying to say the same thing. The poem begins with you, and it's as if the speaker of the poem, also known as me, is trying to move from an I to a you to an everyone throughout the poem. The distance was useful. Sometimes when it comes to making poems, it's about noticing what you need in order to create something, noticing what will help you bring you to the page. Often when we talk about poetry, we talk about voice, which is essentially the way a poem moves musically and rhythmically on the page, the syntax, the prosody of the poem. When I say all my poems come from the creek I grew up across from, what I mean is, it's where I imagine being as quiet as possible and hearing what I call the voice underneath the voice that's always there inside of you, the one that rises up out of a deep silence and speaks back to you. That deep listening is also a way poems come to me. If I'm paying attention to what is moving through me energetically, I can hear the voice that's been me from the beginning, as early as I remember being conscious. One might say the word soul, but it also feels like the person I am at the core. One poem I wrote about in my book, Bright Dead Things, addresses that almost directly. After you toss around the ashes. When she was dying, it was impossible to see forward to the next minute. What was happening for whole weeks was all that was happening and happening and happening. Months before that, I got the dumb soup wrong. How awful, it was all she wanted, and I had gotten it wrong. Then, in the airless days, when it was really happening, we started to power panic, and we didn't know enough. What should we do with her ashes? Water or dirt? Water or dirt? Once she asked to be thrown into the river, where she used to go, still alive but not living anymore. After it was done, I couldn't go back to my life. You understand, right? It wasn't the same. I couldn't tell if I loved myself more or less. It wasn't until later, when I moved in with him and stood outside on our patchy, imperfect lawn, that I remembered what had been circling in me. I am beautiful. I am full of love. I am dying. That turn, that I remembered what had been circling in me, that's me recognizing the voice, the music, what is underneath the chatter of daily living. Sometimes when we practice poetry, we're looking for that core of what matters, the thing that we've been carrying or saying, or what is running rampant in the heart or the mind. When I'm really working on a poem, I'm often so ensconced in the voice and the music of a poem that I can only hear its voice. Once I was working on a poem and I went downstairs to get a cup of tea, and I came back to the office and I was looking around for what I had been listening to. Was it a podcast or an audiobook? What was it that I had just been listening to? The answer, it was me. I had been so focused on the poem and making the poem that it was loud enough, it was a loud enough sound that it was sounded like it was coming from outside of me. That doesn't always happen, but when it does, it feels overwhelmingly strange and gratifying at the same time. This is why I can never listen to music while I write. I love music, and I'm always listening to it and singing along in the car or while I cook. But while I write, I need to be able to bear witness to what is vibrating inside of me for my poetry. I need to be listening to what matters, and that's often represented by sound. When we talk about paying attention and noticing in order to make and write poems, we're talking about it three ways. 1, paying attention to where you are and what's around you. And 2, paying attention to what's inside of you, whether it's memory or emotional matter. And 3, paying attention to the natural rhythm or the music that comes up for you in that moment. The fun thing is that all three things will constantly change, and so no poem will ever be the same. I didn't intend this to be a craft talk, so let me pause and pivot for a moment. You don't need to write poetry in order to pay attention, but for me, poetry helps me make sense of what I am noticing and what noticing does to me. Here's an example of all three of those things coming together: the outside noticing, the inside noticing, and the inner rhythm weaving through. Dead stars. Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us, black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers, a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin, until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerta, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of streetlight with you toward what's larger within us, toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no? No to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, of the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth, if we declared it a clean night, if we stopped being terrified, if we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over? That poem, in many ways, began by noticing the sound of the recycling bins being rolled out at the same time. How it sounded like thunder and almost eerie and communal at the same time. But I didn't start with the sound. I wanted to place us there first, so I went to place out here, which was, of course, the suburbs of Kentucky. And I wanted to situate us in time, in place, so it's winter. We have the cold, the trees bowing as if blown over by the weight of it all. And then we get to the stars, and then we get to the trash bins and the sound that started it all. That's how the poem moved through me. First place, then sensory feeling, then the music. Each poem moves differently because noticing is always different. Every moment we are changing and changed. I will be different when I leave here. I am different now. And now. The joy of having written poems for a long while is that they become living artifacts of your own life. So that it's not that you just notice something once, you get to return to it again and again, like a photograph or a movie or a song you like, and return to that feeling, hold it, and find proof of the life you are living and proof of the life you have lived. All those years ago, when I picked up my first love and we drove down I-5 to our hometown, I remember the heat, the way we had to have the windows open on the interstate so that conversation was near impossible. But we'd crank up the music and sing along, and we'd look at the landscape going by, the road continuing for miles and miles through towns we barely knew, through all of it in silence and loudness at the same time. I remember wanting to hold on to it all, that it seemed impossible that we should ever forget parts of our lives. I don't think that drive was when I became a poet, but I knew I wanted to not miss my life, to not let it go unnoticed. Not all of what any of us do will be extraordinary, but we live in extraordinary times, and we need to do whatever we can do to lean toward the world instead of away from it. Whether you write poems after this, or stare at a tree a little longer, or call your mom, or a friend, or look at a bird, or don't look at a bird. But look at something, notice something. Remember that you are not alone in a world of living things. The one thing I want you to take away from all these words I shared today is, don't miss your life. It's happening right now. Whoever you are, wherever you are living in this moment, and this is a moment that requires our attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that there may be some questions or well, I hope there are questions. In fact, let's just say there will be questions. There are 2 microphones at the front of the room, so what we invite you to do is if you would like to ask something, please come up and maybe as we think about what our questions might be, we can take a collective breath and. It's true that it is embodied kinetic questioning because you have to come up.
Could you be a composer? Could you be a painter? Could you be a sculptor?
I think that one of the things that is really remarkable about living a creative life is how difficult it is to be creative in all the realms. I grew up with my mother as a painter. She's a marvelous painter. And I remember thinking, oh, that will just come to me. And it never did. I still have these moments where I see her draw and I think, I can do that. And then I try and go, that's impossible. But what we had in common, and I think that all the arts have in common, is that kind of paying attention. When she was painting, I remember that she found a hawk that had been killed on the side of the road. And she took its wing off and pinned it to her studio wall so that she could draw it precisely. And I remember thinking, oh, that's what you need to do in order to be an artist, is to look that deeply and to be that willing to look not just at life, but also at death. Thank you for that. You have to stand up and you have to do
That
tech.
looks like
It's a lot.
A decade ago, you gave a talk at my community college, and you mentioned that you had a novel in progress, but it wasn't working out. How's that going?
Okay, I love you. And what community college was it?
Monterey Peninsula
Oh,
College.
yay, Monterey. Henry Marchand.
Yeah, Henry Marchand.
Yeah, he's the best.
Yes, he is. He wrote me a letter of rec.
Oh, I just wrote a note for his retirement.
Is he retiring?
I did. Yeah, he's retiring.
Son of a
Yeah,
bitch.
I know.
Oh, man, my heart. I gotta send him an email.
Education. Okay, so truth be told, I've written actually 3 novels, and they were all terrible. And they didn't get better. So, but you know what? I learned so much from making them, and they were still so joyful that I don't have any regrets. There were times, one of them was written during the pandemic where we just needed to do something, and I couldn't write any more poems about looking out a window, you know? So I was like, I'm gonna have someone else look out a window. So I feel like I learned a lot from making those things. But no, they're still, no one shall never see the light of day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I was actually also going to ask him about a novel, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you've tried it out. Thank you for your reading. It was really lovely. You were talking about themes that you tend to come back to since you've been writing for so long. I was curious what those themes are that maybe you come back to, and maybe in hindsight you're like, oh, I continue to write these themes, and if maybe those things are in conversation, or, what have you learned, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful question. And when I was putting together the new and selected, it was so strange because I just, I put some poems from each book into it along with the new poems. And I think the biggest overarching theme, and I think this might be true of most poets and perhaps most artists, is mortality. It's the mystery, strangeness, and certainty of death. And it's in every poem I write. And I can look, that one of the early poems that I read, the Echo Sounder, I think I wrote that when I was 23. And I'm contemplating my own death. So I think that's a huge part of my work. But I also think that's an impulse for many artists to be like, well, what do we make with this time that we have? But also the mystery of how strange it is to love so deeply and then to lose. So that's constantly something that I am dealing with, as we all are. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
I love that you just said cool. Yeah. Hey, mortality.
I got nothing, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all going to die.
Okay, you mentioned you love music. Have
Yeah.
you ever tried writing songs, and what recommendations would you make to people that are trying to use poetry to get lyrics?
I love that. Well, there's two ways to answer that question, and I'll just be truthful with the first one, which is that I did write lyrics. I was in a band called Lucky Wreck, which was the name of my first book, and it was so fun, and it was wonderful, and I actually love writing songs. Now, writing songs and writing poetry, very, very different. And although we can look at that similarity because of language, the compression of language, all of those things that we need to do, but lyrics are waiting for the music. The poem is complete. The poem has all the music right there. And so oftentimes if you're trying to make poems into lyrics, you kind of have to follow it almost like a conductor, like the music's already on the page. You can't really make your music and then put a poem to it. So that's one of the things that I would say. And then the other thing I would say is that if you're trying to make lyrics, remember that that's when everything comes in. If you're trying to make poems, the bass line is there, it has to be there. That's often the repetition. The structure and the form is all on the page. So that's a complete song, is a poem on the page.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you did an MFA, I believe, in creative writing.
I did.
And so I was kind of, as someone who's going to be applying within the next 2 cycles for MFA programs, I've seen a lot of people talk about like, oh, you shouldn't do an MFA if this is what you want to get out of writing, if this is what you want. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience and sort of maybe not necessarily pros and cons, but just kind of like what your experience is with that.
Yeah. I think it's such a personal decision. It's really hard for anyone to give advice to another person. But I think that for me, my MFA was life-changing. My undergraduate degree is in theater. And so in order to really get to where I wanted to be as a poet, I needed the education, the reading, the structure, the deadlines. And that was really important. I worked with incredible teachers, Sharon Olds, Phil Levine, Marie Howe, some of the finest people that I know. And I wouldn't be the writer I am today without them. However, I know some people who are such self-starters that they don't need it, because they're seekers, right? They're going to go find the community that's going to read their poems. They're going to find the books that they need. They're going to be able to actually write and make a life out of writing without the MFA. So it's really about who you are. I also think I went into a great deal of debt to go to graduate school, and I think I would make a different choice now. I think I probably would have, even though I loved where I went and it was exactly what I needed, I think that I would follow programs that had more funding.
Yeah, that makes
Love you,
perfect
NYU,
sense.
but I would.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Hi. Something that I began thinking about, and I struggle with, maybe in poetry, maybe thinking about art in general, that you touched on was the, like, I guess, not quite possession or distillment, but just containing some kind of feeling in order that you said to return back to as proof that you have lived. And I sometimes struggle with having this feeling to return back to while also living in the present. I almost feel that the life that I am living and the life that I have lived can't coexist, or that I can't focus on them at the same time. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think that poets have a really fascinating relationship with time. So I'll just say you're already a poet, because that is what we struggle with. We have this relationship with that feels really wobbly. And someone once asked me, like, well, how do you write poems that start in the present and then suddenly you're in the past? And I'm always like, oh, because time doesn't exist. And I said it just came out of my mouth. And so I think that there is a sort of blurry structure that we have with time, a relationship with simultaneity, things happening all at once. So I would say that I would, if I were you and that was where I was feeling a kind of friction, I think I would be really curious about it. I think I would explore that. And I think I would think, okay, what is it that's going to help me let go of that friction or dive into it and see what's interesting? For example, if you have trouble staying in the present, I would, like, my prompt would be write 5 poems that are all in the present tense. You can't go past and you can't go forward, you know? So I would just try to, for me, I think that's so self-aware of you. And so now that you have that, I would take that as like, oh, this is an artistic endeavor I might need to unravel for quite some time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
You spoke about paying attention to and holding like really heavy and hard parts of your life and how you had to change form in order to grapple with that. And I'm wondering how your career and your relationship with the medium has progressed, how that has changed. Do you still like have to grapple with form to reconcile with that, or is it a different process now?
Yeah. You know, I had the benefit, like most poets do, of writing poems and knowing no one was going to read them. And it's a really freeing, beautiful thing. And I would send them to loved ones that I trusted, right, with my work. And so now I have to do a different thing when I want to write something that's really private and intimate and secret. And that is sometimes writing poems that I tell myself I will never publish. But that is not to discount the power of those poems. I still need to write them, and I still need to put something down so that I don't have to hold it. I always say poems is my answer to where do I put all this. And so sometimes I have to write secret poems. And, you know, with my book, The Carrying, I think half of those poems were secret poems. And then 3 years passed, and I looked at them and I thought, I can publish 1 or 2 of these. And then it became the book. But it was, you know, about sometimes making the poem regardless of sharing it and being ready to share it. So that's how I've shifted. Whereas before I would just write it and send it, or, you know, give it to friends and it'd be fine. But now I want to protect myself so that I always keep writing poems. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
I was curious, when delving so deeply into yourself, what do you do if you feel that the language that you're working with doesn't accurately portray the depth of your feelings and what you're seeing or anything?
Well, it never does. I mean, that's what's kind of interesting, is that as a poet, we have this relationship with failure because what we're trying to do is translate precisely what's going on in the brain and the heart and the mind, and then put it on the page, and then hope someone else will understand what's going on exactly and precisely in that moment. And that never is going to happen. Someone is going to look at it and they might see something in it. They might recognize something. You might recognize something in it. But it's never going to be exact and precise. So I think that allowing for that and knowing that the problem with language is that it's language and it's not telepathy. And so at some point it will fail us and does fail us all the time. And so for me, I try to make use of that. For me, that's where the caesuras and the line breaks and the pauses come in, because poetry speaks in its silences. And so that's where the music comes in, the structure and the form, because poetry speaks through its form and its container. And so that's saying even more than the language sometimes, or at least it's adding to what language is there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. In your first book, there's a short 3-line poem called This Darkness. And it says this darkness is not the scary one, it's the one before the sun comes up, the one you can still breathe in. It's been 20 years. Do you think we're still in the darkness before the sun comes up? And second part, I've been turning to your poetry in times of darkness. Who do you turn to now? Like, who are you reading?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I had a lot of little poems in that book, and some of them got cut, but I still remember them. And one of them was just kind of silly, and it said, "They say all you need is love, but I really think we need health insurance." And the editor cut it out, which was totally fair. It didn't really go along with the book. But no, I think that that darkness that I'm speaking of in that particular poem was personal, and it was the idea of that not all darkness is the same, right? That there's some that is still you can breathe in, and you're like, oh right, the dawn is coming. So I think that we're still in that place. I mean, I think we're in a scarier place, and I think the precarity of this moment is so overwhelming that I am looking not just to poets, but to great minds that I admire. But my worry is that we somehow think that technology is going to save us, when in reality, it won't. It's only going to be the imagination. It's only going to be our own intelligence. And so I think who I'm looking to now are poets from the past in some ways. I'm reading a lot of Yeats right now. I've been reading Emily Dickinson pretty much for the last 3 years. And I keep thinking of that quote she has, "Not knowing when the dawn will come, I open every door." Because I keep thinking that that's poems, right? And you go, this, I needed this door, I needed this door, I needed this door. So yeah, no, I think that where we are at is profoundly different. And it is the scariest time I've been alive in so far. But I think that we have so many people that are doing so much good work. And I know that we always have that quote about, Mr. Rogers saying, look for the helpers. And I do. I look for the stewards. I look for the helpers. I look for the people that have been doing the good work to save what we can for their entire lives. But beyond that, I try to be a helper too. And so I think that, this darkness is the scariest one I've been in. But I still think we can breathe in it, and I think we have to breathe in it. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
I noticed that something that you said earlier on in your talk today was that at 23 years old, you still did not consider yourself a poet, which implies that later on you had this revelation. And so I had a question about youth and then you reflecting on said youth, because I think that there's a big weakness about growing up where you have this false misconception that you know everything and you can plan for everything. And so knowing that you did not plan to be a poet, what were the biggest failures and hardships that you had to experience that you can now reflect on that pushed you to be a better writer today?
Yeah, thank you for that beautiful question. I think for me, I knew I wanted to be a maker in some ways. I knew I had a creative spirit. I knew that was what I was supposed to do. And so when I was in theater, I learned so much from that experience. But a lot of it was embodying and memorizing other people's language. And then when I got to poetry and I was able to embody my own language and to write my own life, I suddenly was like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I felt it. It was a shift. Now, when I say I don't know if I thought I was a poet, I think that it took me a long time to say I was a poet. And it, you know, I hate to say this about me, but it wasn't until my first book came out where I really felt like I could say it. It just was something that I felt like I couldn't, because when you said you were a poet, the first question was, oh, do you have a book out? You know, and so I think there was this part of me that felt that as a response from others. But in terms of the biggest sort of lesson for me was, what year is it? Okay, 16 years ago, my stepmother died of colorectal cancer. She was 51. And my little brother, and my father and I were all there. It was a home death. And it shifted me forever, because I knew then that I didn't want to miss any part of this life, whatever happened, that I wanted to pay attention. And that was a defining moment for me. And of course, I didn't know that she was going to pass in that way, and you know, all of these things, even though she was sick for a long time. But that kind of lesson was something, I think about daily. And you know, watching someone that young pass away, you think, okay, what if that's all I had left? What would I do, right? How would I live? What would I choose? And I've always thought a really beautiful experiment for all of us is to think of ourselves, if we're lucky enough to live for an old age, and think, what would I want to look back on? And then start building from there. And, you know, I was lucky enough to lose someone that I loved in a way that profoundly shifted my life. I always think that's the gift she gave me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. I want to say, first of all, I'm inspired by the way you interweave the inner and outer worlds, and the way you let your mind go allowed me to do that as well.
Okay.
So it's kind of an own awakening through poetry. You can allow yourself to connect to your own inner and outer world, and I think that's really beautiful. So thank you for that gift.
Thank you.
And also, I was struck by how you said there's a difference between seeing the birds and then saving the birds. So how do you think your own art, or art and poetry, helps support stewardship and action in the world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, I think that I've always maintained that I think it's really overwhelming to try to do everything at once. So one of my projects as the Poet Laureate, when I served as a Poet Laureate for 3 years, was to create a project called You Are Here. And we put poetry into the parks, into the 7 different regions of the national parks. And meeting with those stewards was really phenomenal. And so it was a way that I could bring poetry and the national parks and be able to drive people to the parks, but also drive people to poetry. And I always think that the arts are a really beautiful way to bring awareness to different causes. I think about the great work of Amy Tan, whose novels have been incredible through, you know, but her book, you know, Backyard Birds, is really phenomenal, and it has driven all these people to not just pay attention to birds, but then the way that birds then bring you to, what watershed am I in? Why are we losing this many birds? What is it, right? So it leads you to those questions. And so I think that is my big offering, is the idea of paying attention, the idea of moving with intention and love. And then for me, it's all about the natural world. So that working with, whether or not it's Bird Note or the Audubon Society or the national parks, but those are all partnerships that I've worked with in the last 3 years. Yeah.
Thank you from a fellow birder.
Oh, thank you.
Hi. I am so excited to be talking to you right now. This is like meeting my favorite pop star.
Oh.
So my question is, I had a writing teacher like 10 years ago tell me that I needed to be careful not to do masturbatory writing. And
That sounds fun.
yeah, he was very honest, which I appreciated. But writing can have so many different contexts, right? Like sharing with your family members when I was little, like poetry was for communicating with my mom. How do you know when it's for the world?
Every poem is different. Sometimes it's not for the world. I think that I still have private poems that are in books, but those are private poems. And then I have public poems that feel like they're very public poems. And the sort of beauty about writing poetry is that because of its form, each poem gets to do a different thing. So you might write one poem one week that is so secret and is really supposed to be for you and your beloveds. And then you might write the next week a poem that is supposed to be, that it's speaking to a wider world, that it's speaking to your community. But, you can't really decide until you're ready to have those conversations. I think about, for me, I have poems that I know I wanted to speak to a wider audience. And I was thoughtfully thinking about that. Okay, this is who I want to speak to. And then there are poems where I begin, I don't even know it's for anyone. And it just feels so private and so my own. And you have to have both in order to, I think, flourish as an artist. So I think it's about who you want to connect to. Think about who, and if that's important. Because it also might not be. There are times where you might be like, this is not for these people. And that's beautiful too. So it's really about who you want to make art for. And then trying to make that art that feels really true to yourself in that connection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Cool. Hi, Ada.
Hi.
I run an online poetry workshop called Unfold, and we meet each day every April on Zoom.
It's a great name.
Thank you. Yeah, big fan. And I'm just curious if you have any advice for poets doing the insane thing each April of trying to write a poem every day, maybe around like getting out of your own way or whatever your thoughts are.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, during National Poetry Month, the month of April, many poets put ourselves in this terrible conundrum, which is that we try to write a poem every single day.
Yep.
The great William Stafford said, how do you write a poem a day? And he said, I just lower my expectations. And I think that's true. I think for me, what I do is I start to not think of them as poems, but seeds of poems. And that helps me because then I'll get something down and I'll at least have something. And usually I'll say that by the end of April, I often have 4 poems. And that's 4 more poems than I would have had. So I always say, go for it. And, it's that whole Beckett, fail more, So yeah, I would just say keep doing it because I've done it for, I think since 2004. So, and I have a lot of poems from it and a lot of terrible, terrible drafts. That we need. They exist. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you again so much for being here. I wanted to ask a question about many, many, many moons ago. I read like a scrap of an article that mentioned you in this idea of secret poets, of people who write but do not share, and that they themselves are also poets. And to like little tiny me, this was very exciting that I didn't need to share to validate my own creation. But I was thinking in this world where I think people now have the ability to make more than they should and to make the wrong things, what should we be making and what do we owe it to each other to share?
I think that's a really great point. I think that, I didn't come into myself as a poet during Instagram, TikTok, and all of the different social media platforms that we have. And so what we had were a thing called blogs, which now people call Substacks. And that was where we put all of our brand new drafts. And I remember very clearly the moment when I couldn't put my drafts on there anymore. And it was when a poet that I love, Dorianne Lux, shared one of my drafts from my blogs onto her Facebook page. And the draft was so terrible. And she loved it because she was just, I don't know, it was about Matt Damon, and she thought it was funny. And I was like, oh my God, that's a terrible poem. I was just, fooling around or whatever. So I think that there is something to be said for, I think of it as the longevity, that's what scares me. I don't care about making bad art. You know what? I care about the climate crisis and war and genocide. But make as much bad art as you want. But what I worry about is that it's now there forever. And so what I try to do, even when I make a post, I think, oh, this will now be out there forever. So I'm very cautious with my new drafts and with anything. And I also really worry about the algorithms of artificial intelligence and what that work and how that work will be used, stolen for these huge machines that are co-opting our imagination and our art forms. So for me, it would be about protecting really, truly the art you want to make, and also for your future self. And then in terms of the art we need it all. We need it all. We really do. I mean, the joke used to be when I became Poet Laureate, my friend said, oh, great, yeah, because she likes every poem. And I like that poems exist, and people read me poems, and yeah, maybe it's not a great poem, but I'm glad it exists. I really am. I'm legitimately glad it exists. And that to me, it's not cynical. That to me is like, okay, this is what you did with your life today was you made a poem? Like, yes, I'm so glad for that. So yeah, we need it all different kinds, all different, everything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, and I have to catch my train back to Portland like right after this. So no disrespect, but I'm gonna need to. But like this feels as a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I'm also Mexican American, and I just really, I guess my question is, what advice would you have for an artist that is difficult, like having difficulties moving forward in their craft and thus their life because of having to face that inner world is so painful that it is easier to stay numb?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for that. I think one of the biggest things that we don't allow ourselves as poets is we don't always have to go to the bottom of the well. I've always said you go down to the bottom of the well only when you know there's a ladder out. And I think we have this strange idea that good poems are the darkest, hardest poems that delve into the hardest parts of our soul. That's not true. A lot of our poems, they make room for that darkness, but then they hold so much space for everything else. The poem itself is an act of resilience. It's like, oh, I'm here, I'm making this. So I would say that if the artist is having an issue with getting past where they are emotionally or where they have been emotionally, I would say then it's time to move forward in a different direction. Follow something else. You don't have to be your own therapist on the page. Your therapist gets to be your therapist, And what you get to do is make art. And I think that poets in particular have we've come up with this rule for ourselves that we have to expose every part of our lives. But your poems want to be protective. They want to be spells. Really good, magical, scary, awesome spells that do work in the world. They don't always want to go backwards. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Hi there. I just like to say that words are powerful, and your words can move mountains. And with that said, while you're writing your poems and you're trying to figure out your vocab and everything, how do you know that you're choosing the right words to convey such powerful emotions?
Yeah. For me, I constantly write my poems aloud. I'm just listening to them over and over and over again. In fact, a lot of my first lines come to me in my head, and I memorize them before I get home because it's the sound that's driving me. So almost always it's not just about the words themselves, but the sound and the kinetic energy between the two words are the language. So it's always about music for me. So that it's, yes, I want the right word, but I want the right sound. So yeah, that's for me. It's not just about language, but the way that it lands in the ear.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I love the turns you have in your poetry. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the process of getting to those turns.
Yeah. I really appreciate this question. And you're not talking about the birds. You're talking about the...
Well, I love birds
the
too.
turn.
Yeah.
I am obsessed with endings. And in many ways, in all shapes and form, in poetry and in life, I'm obsessed with endings. And I think the biggest mistake that I see with my own work is a choice not made, that there's not a choice at the end. That someone's like, well, it could be whatever you want it to be. And I'm always going, what is this poem teaching me? As I'm writing it, I'm going back to the beginning. What is it? Why does this matter? Why did I choose this? What is true? And then I sometimes see, sometimes, not always, but I see something and I go, oh, this is why.
That's why, yeah. Okay.
This is why this story has been on my heart for years. This is why this image has been in my mind. This is why I was moved when this happened. But I have to keep asking myself, what is the truth? Why this? Why now? Why has it come to me? And that's usually the turn.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. And what a lovely talk.
Thank you.
My question is similar to your answer here, but it's edit. It's the editor in you when you write, when you finish writing. Tell me about that process for you. I find that often I'm very in love with what I'm doing, and I can't contain it, and it's hard to let go of things. So how do you play that role with yourself?
I think that's so beautiful that you're in love with what you're doing. That's amazing. It's like the opposite of what I usually hear. Everyone's like, I hate everything I've ever written. And I'm like, well, okay, that's a problem. So, because I'm always like, this is, if I have a first draft of anything, I'm like, that's a draft. That exists, right? There's the Jane Smiley quote, all the first draft has to do is exist. And I think about that all the time. So when I edit, I begin in praise. I begin with, I'm so happy it exists. I'm so happy that this came out. Oh, interesting that this is how I wrote this. And then I start to read it aloud and go, okay, where are the places that, if this is going from me to someone else, what are the parts that I would start to change and shift? Where do I want it to tighten up or loosen up, right? Sometimes you want it to be perfect, and sometimes it needs more distressing. I always think for me is when a poem is done, it feels like you could put a magnet at its core, and all the lines would go to it. They would all go, that's my core, that is it. So it has to be charged by the same thing. And so for me, revising is just making sure that everything that's on that page is going toward that center. Yeah, thank you.
This is a great place to end.
Thank you
so much. Oh, okay, we'll take one more.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. This might be a silly question, but I remember when I was reading Bright Dead Things, and your talk hit on this in many forms, the illumination, right? Opening up clearings and things like that. And you've been talking about music rather than the visual quite a bit. And one of the things I noticed when reading your poems, and I am a fan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For giving me all this pleasure and insight. But one of the things I noticed about your poems is that I had to get accustomed to your rhythm. And your rhythm was what allowed me to see the brightness and no dead things at all, actually, but everything vibrating. So I'd like to ask you, how important is your rhythm for your poetry? And do you try to use it in a way that takes us out of the rhythms we're already in, that in a sense allow us to pay attention to new things?
Yes, that's a beautiful question. And that is line breaks. I'm obsessed with line breaks. And anyone who knows my work will notice that one poem is a mid-length line, one is a shorter line, one is a long line. Sometimes there's different breaks, and all of that is me telling you exactly how I want your breath to move when you read the poem. It is me being a conductor on the page. I want you to follow that rhythm exactly. When there are words that are broken up, I want you to read it that way. And that is entirely intentional. It's enough so to make you crazy, because that's what we revise for. At least for me, it's just line breaks, line breaks, line breaks. And, you know, very early on, I remember studying with Mark Doty, who was like, you know, this shorter line, that's Dickinson. That's the interior. That's the quiet mystery line. And then the longer line, that's Whitman. That's, you know, him still talking somewhere. And like the mid-length line is Shakespeare. The mid-length line is speech. You know, I write an iambic pentameter often. I don't even know that I do it. But so each poem requires a different line length in order for its engine to do what it needs to do. So the rhythm is key. The rhythm is everything. That's the music. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So Ada Limon has very generously agreed to stay and sign books. We can do that with help from our friends from J. Michael's Books. So we are asking that you put a Post-it with your name on the cover of the book so that the signing process can move smoothly.